dedicated to Henry Foreman. In the years of the primal force and the dawn of terrestrial birth, man mastered the mammoth and horde, and man was the lord of the earth. He made him an hollow skin from the heart of an holy tree. He compassed the earth therein, and man was the lord of the sea. He controlled the vigorous steam. He harnessed the lightning for hire. He drove the celestial team, and man was the lord of the fire. Deep mouths from their thrones.
Well, my fine feathered fiends, welcome to episode 63 of Agitators Anonymous. I am Alan Averill, and how are we all doing from a wet, rainy, grey and somewhat miserably predictable Dublin? How do I find you? Well, now, this podcast will be mainly about music, a discussion of two statements in the press recently, a little bit of a discussion around content, a little bit of discussion about what the next few months might have in store for the music industry, which has been, quite frankly, the annus horribilis, which may not be quite what you think when you hear those two words, but definitely this has been the most desperate time for live musicians, for traveling musicians, for anybody creative really. And we keep hearing about money being poured into, again, I keep mentioning this fictitious arts council that we have in Ireland and their plans for this, that and the other. And I keep hearing about money being poured into this, that and the other. But yet at the same time, the state does not allow people inside. So how can we have a show, an art exhibition, a this, a that, or the other, or anything that has some sort of human process? The prospect of it just being corralled or just being paid to those who wish to do things online, of course, is a very real reality. And now, I'm not going to start talking about variants and this, that, and the other, but we have this Delta variant, which now presents a whole new angle for the mainstream media to try and scare people and to provide the unelected health officials with more ammunition with which to, in my opinion, keep people in their place. It's, classic propagandaizing, just at the moment when it looked like society was taking a step or two back to reopening. This can be used to hold that at arm's length for a while, in my opinion. What do I know? I'm just a singer in a heavy metal band, I hear you say. Good point. Good point indeed. Well, episode 63, like I said, is going to be a little bit about the music industry. So the first ad read will be metalblade.com, almost 40 years of heavy metal history. If you're in North America, you can use the promo code AA Podcast and you will get 10% off your order. Get to it. And first of all, let's start with a quote from, this is from the New York Times. Trivium frontman Matt Heafy spoke to the New York Times about the overwhelming success of his Twitch channel, which boasts a follower count of 220,000. Matt, who streams everything from video games, guitar clinics to Trivium and acoustic song covers, all while he's off the road and awaiting the next Trivium album tour cycle, said that the Twitch channel generated just under $10,000 a month in 2019 and 2020. Trivium collect an average of $11,000 a month from on-demand services like Spotify, Apple Music and YouTube. Now, I ain't no Trivium fan, but that's a pretty interesting statement, a pretty interesting quote, and also has a rather dim and dark reflection on the music industry. I mean, the reality is that Matt, as an internet personality, a content creator, makes far more money than he does from selling I suppose hundreds of thousands of records. Trivium at their peak would have sold hundreds of thousands of albums, and there's no doubt that there's many streams coming in for the band. I'm sure if you look them up on Spotify, they have a couple of 100,000 followers, millions of streams, and the idea that still, regardless of that history of 20 years probably of making music, that people watching him play games makes him more of an income. And I can't begin to tell you the amount of times that I've sat in boardrooms with music company executives who basically have used someone like Matt Heafy as an example and said to, well, the likes of me, why can't you be a little bit more like him? Now, first, let's dissect some of that statement. The first things first is that Trivium Trivium fans, I suppose, were a little bit younger, a little bit more normalized to the internet, to gaming, to all those kind of things. They'd probably be far more amenable to all of that, and they grew as Heafy grew. I mean, they were a band, of course, that said nothing or meant nothing to people like me. They weren't for our generation, but for the generation of younger fans, they grew up alongside him. So gaming doesn't have gatekeeping like the music industry does, and people who watch other people play games, which is still kind of a mystery to me as to why anybody would do that. People do, in their hundreds of thousands, and it's a very tip-easy culture. People tip quickly, they tip easily, and what Matt Heafy has done there is basically has created an online persona for himself that really, to be honest, isn't dependent on music. It's dependent on him waking up in the morning and thinking, right, what am I going to do today? I'm going to do that acoustic AHA cover. I'm going to do a little guitar playthrough. Here's me making coffee. Okay, we're going to play some games today. Here's my little studio. And on one level, you've got to appreciate the fact that it's a cottage industry that is not gate-kept by management. That's not gate-kept by record companies. But yet at the same time, on the negative side, what it's saying is that your art is not good enough to make you a living. Your art is not good enough to make you a living. And that despite you coming from a successful band who have hundreds of thousands of followers and have probably sold up 1 million or 2 million records, I would imagine, of all in total, this is not enough to make you any living outside of the touring cycle, because obviously that's what's been taken from musicians by the pandemic, and it doesn't look like it's something that's going to come back very easily. If you look at all the arbitrary rules and restrictions based now on flying and traveling, and I'll get into that as we move through the podcast. But what that states is that Matt's cottage industry more or less has him housebound. Now, that's depending on how you look at those things. For me, the reason why I started playing music was to be in a room with people, was to travel, to have agency, to have purpose. And I suppose on a very micro level, something like me doing this podcast, or if you've been over on my YouTube channel and looked at my silly Call from the Grave series, looking at bands' careers, I suppose on some level I am trying to play the Heafy game. I'm just 15 years behind the curve. It's not what Primordial fans want to see, is me playing games, is me doing this, that and the other. But I think under the circumstances you are allowed a little bit of leeway. A podcast, for example, suits me fine because I've always been a person who has an awful lot to say, probably too much to say by some people's admission or judgment, but it is what it is. And so the podcast format sort of suits my the way my grey matter fires. But what that is saying is that to a musician, there is no livelihood for you without touring, without festivaling, without traveling. And if for you to have that livelihood, you have to basically have an internet personality. Now, we have to say something about, for example, Trivium and Matt Heafy, is that he was a personality before lockdown. So the idea that the New York Times is basically, it is quoting a success story, which is what they keep looking for throughout the mainstream media, is this, oh, look what the clever things musicians are doing to cope. I never see the real disaster story of how are we doing this to art, to live music, to all of these things. The things that artists are now basically being told to do, which is that your creative instinct, the very sort of reason for your being, purpose, agency, all those kind of ephemeral things are literally mean nothing, and can you please get on Instagram and start posting. I don't really read those stories too much, and there's a certain huge silence, which I'll get to from my next quote, from many, many bigger musicians who just seem unwilling to tackle the shackles placed on the music industry or live entertainment industry by arbitrary rules and restrictions of health officials. But we've learned that art over the last 18 months pretty much has no lobby and pretty much means nothing. Like I said, and I've said this 4 or 5 times in the podcast, someone said to me, "Why do you care about the theatre? You never went." Well, my friend, I care because it's one of the oldest artistic expressions known to man and is part of our culture, our history, our folklore. And I don't wish everything to just go the way of the dodo, such as playing in a band. The reason for which I started doing so was to be in a room with other people, whether they were the musicians you make music with or the commune of playing that music for people. I didn't do it to be a content creator sitting at the other end of a screen. But this particular Heafy quote from the New York Times, I think is really interesting. And if we kind of dig down into it a little bit, it's even more interesting. Is he earns, now let me just look at this, on just under $10,000 a month in 2019 and 2020. Now I would imagine most of that is from people tipping him for playing computer games. And Trivium collect an average of $11,000 a month. Now consider that Trivium probably are having to pay management or pay some employees of some description in this fallow period. Because I do know for a fact that many managers, many people who are involved in the band crew, of course, have no work either. Now, there's very few bands who are big enough to subsidize a crew not doing very much in this downtime from non-existent digital royalties. But of that $11,000 a month, consider that that probably is split between 4 band members. That could be songwriting royalties from different things here and there. Maybe some is live performance royalties from the last couple of years before everything was shut down. Our management taking their percentage as well. This is pre-tax, taxed by 5. And this is one of the things that every time I read something about the artist, and I'm doing little parenthesis, rabbit ears for those of you who have their spy cameras in my dungeon. The fact is that in the mainstream media, most times they talk about the artist, and that's because most of the discussions of the modern music industry are about artists singular, because you will notice even with pop bands, there aren't really pop bands anymore. It's about one person. Names, DJ names, Ariana Grande, blah, blah, blah. It's just names. That was the first name that came into my head. Because a band is too difficult to market in relation to pop music terms. But the mainstream media will discuss the artist as if it's always just one person, an electronic artist in their basement collecting all of the royalties, which of course is not the case for indie, rock, metal, punk, whatever else. It's a band. So this constant referral to the artist is a misnomer. It's a mistake. That's not really how things work, because when Primordial gets, let's say, digital royalties, they are pre-tax and pre-split by 5. So it's just dribs and drabs of 50 here, 100 here, 150 there. Nothing really that makes any particular difference to your life, so to speak, but dribs and drabs. And I presume most bands are the same in the sense that they are multiple people. Now, of course, if you have different publishing percentages, etc., this can change, but the constant referral to the artist is incorrect. So I presume that the Matt Heafy, Trivium money that comes in every month while he's not touring or playing gigs is his chump change compared to what he actually makes off his other accounts. Also, the follower count of 220,000 is huge. This is a huge amount of people. So he's been building this cottage industry probably for a decade. So when somebody says to me, well, why can't you do that? You're already starting, not only are you born in the wrong decade, playing the wrong kind of music, but you're trying to play a decade of catch-up. And in reality, doing that is not the reason why some of us started playing in bands. I was on a big Zoom call with a lot of people very recently, and a friend of mine piped up and she said, well, this isn't the reason why I became an artist, to have to work the crowd like this, like the comedian who only does crowd work. Where are you from? How you doing? Blah, blah, blah. It's not why many of us started trying to become creative. Now, admittedly, okay, the reasons why you're 15, 16 are a little bit different. You want to be in a gang and you want this and you want that and the other. But, as you settle into the idea that you have some artistic creativity to explore, you don't anticipate that hinges all on your social media nous, I suppose is the word, not noose, nous. So the idea is that in this the principle of this podcast, the things I'm trying to get my head around is the idea that most musicians now are being forced into having to make content to somehow try and cope. And the using the Matt Heafy as an example is a bad example, because he was way out of the curve to begin with. And his fans, the age that they were and the things that they grew up in being interested in, fully fit into the idea that the guy from the band that they grew up with, they're going to watch him play games and learn how to play the guitar with him and all sorts of things. It makes an awful lot of sense on those terms. But the idea that without touring and traveling and playing festivals, you're earning literally nothing unless you've made or created this cottage economy, is pretty grim, to say the least. And so on those terms, people have said it to me, you've got to start making content. Now, what does that mean? And this is sort of what brings me to the next part of what the podcast, or what I wanted to talk about today, is that for someone like me, talking in a podcast suits me, but should I stay out of politics? Should I stay out of having an opinion? It's clear that certain times, now of course, posting something on Facebook is not the same as it was 10 years ago. It's like Grandpa Simpson shouting at the wind. I'm aware it's an antiquated forum and it all feels a bit pointless. It reminds you of your angry aunt who's shouting things into the void. I hate Trump because blah, blah, blah. And you go, hey, you live in a middle-class suburb of South County Dublin. What's it got to do with you? I mean, look, and who are you talking to? What's going on? Why are you engaging like this? And there's a feeling when you post something on Facebook, sometimes I do, it gets the better of me. I want to go, hey, look, do you see what they're doing? Prepping you for the Delta variant lockdown. Can you see that already? And then you realize, oh, it reaches a handful of people and it all feels a bit pathetic. So you just delete it. You make your point. You delete it. You move on. But is there something to be said for this damned if you do, damned if you don't? I.e., can you please make some content, says X record label, to try and keep your career in some form of, just not quite in the dark completely, but just as some form of dusty old shadows that a few people can view, because if this all gets dusted off, you'll have a little bit more of a platform? Or is it just some kind of something to occupy the grey matter during this crazy period of inactivity, where the thing that you were meant to be has been basically essentially taken from you? So you're damned if you do and damned if you don't. Should I stay out of politics? Is there any reason for me to get involved? Why do you ask questions on these terms? Is it counterproductive when all things are considered? Because what I have noticed is that some people will be against me on the principle that it's me, i.e. they protest the protester. And people watch, of course, to make sure that you fuck up, that you say something you regret, etc., etc. And the idea that you are throwing out so many words into the ether that any one of them could be used against you is quite a heavy burden, when at the same time you have people within the music industry going, please make content. And you think to yourself, well, what is this? You just want me to make sort of middle of the road milquetoast content with no edge to it at all? Just what do you want me to do? Just like film myself playing football? Hey, here's me making coffee, this, that, and you realize that that's kind of what people want. But yet at the same time, how is it that once upon a time in the 1980s and the 1970s, we understood, and even the 1960s, we go back to Bob Dylan and that kind of thing, you understood that musicians had things to say. They had things to say about the state of the world and politics. And it seems to have been deafeningly silent from musicians over the last 18 months. Many musicians, of course, were anti-Trump. There's anti-Trump, that anti-blah. I mean, look, that was easy. That was like shooting a huge, ugly fish with a wig on in a tiny barrel. I get that was very, very easy. But in the last 18 months, it has been really quite shocking and surprising to me how many musicians and people in the music entertainment industry, or whatever you want to call it, and I hate using that word entertainment, but how many artists have just been literally silent. And I think that's part of that is a sort of Trump hangover, in the sense that if Trump had said, I'm for lockdown, many people would have been against it. It was that simple. Instead, it was the other way around. And so many artists have come out on the side of the sort of collectivism of enforced lockdown. And now that we're 18 months into it, and there's, the whole vaccination process, and it's becoming pretty clear that you're going to need this to be a traveling musician. I still don't really see many musicians speaking out about the situation, trying to address the fact that nobody has stood on a stage, that still no one knows if we're going to be able to tour, if we're going to be able to have festivals. I mean, many things are being organised for next year. You probably saw, I posted the Hellfest lineup, which is insane, absolutely insane, 2 weekends in a row. And part of me knows why Hellfest have done this. They basically said to the local area, the local community, do you know how many millions of euros going to be coming in tourist money into the economy, into the local economy? This is the biggest music festival in the world this year. Go ahead. We double dare you, cancel it. Part of me believes that is also behind this. It's huge. It's probably the biggest metal festival or rock festival, let's be honest, music festival of next year. I can't see anything else having a bigger lineup than that. And who would dare cancel it? Well, we've seen already in the last 18 months that the lobby group of artists in the entertainment industry seems, to me, almost impotent, seems to have done more or less nothing. No one has stood on a stage here. I watched people across the road from me queue up, masked, and with their PCR tests in their hands to go and stand in a field in a painted square on the grass, distance from everybody else, seated to watch somebody play far away. And you just thought, my God, real music can't happen like this, as in artistic expression in public cannot be at the behest of an unelected health official group, or else it will just never happen. It reminded me of some sort of NKVD style Stasi-approved state opera there, where the head members of the NKV would have sat in the front row and everybody else would have to watch them and applaud when they applauded and all that kind of thing. Yes, I'm being a bit over the top, but you understand what I mean. If artistic and public expressions are only at the behest of health and safety, well then we can see in the last 18 months how small and lacking in power that lobby group is, but also how few musicians seem to have tried to stand up and say, no, hang on, look, come on, there has to be more funding for this, that and the other. The second ad read is for EISENWALD Records. You need to go to www.eisenton.de or .com. Use the promo code ALAN and you'll get 10% off your order. Loads of post-black metal, pagan metal, etc., up and coming strong acts there. You need to get on it. It's clear that the collectivism at the heart of the lockdown mindset, which appeals to people, or would appear to appeal to people on the new left side of politics, and I hate using those sides because I don't think they're really applicable, so I put new in front of them. That collectivism at the heart of it, I can see it in Ireland, that everyone is just like, hey, there's money coming to the industry. Shut up. Stay quiet. You're in furlough. You're getting money from the state. What do you want? Well, of course, that's part of the, I suppose you could call it, the collectivist socialist mindset, the welfare state at the heart of it. I get that. I understand that for a country that came through poverty like Ireland did for so many decades, that the idea that the state is just now in a very organised and orderly fashion supporting people financially. I explained to one representative of said state body, well, I'm a musician, I'm a travelling musician, and I got the, oh God, you'll be the last out. Jesus, well, hold tight now. Good luck to you. And, you know, it was like a sketch from an Irish TV show. And no problem. They facilitated everyone very fairly and very well. I can't complain about that, as I have complained about many other things in the state. But at the same time, that is not why you are a musician or a creative person or even a human being to just endlessly exist in rolling over furlough and just collecting the money and go back around to go. But you don't go anywhere. You have no agency, purpose, and there certainly ain't no rock and roll happening at all. And so why have so few musicians even spoken out about any of this stuff? At least not that I can find. Maybe I'm in the wrong loops. I don't know. But it strikes me that the entire industry is just holding its breath, waiting to see, can this happen? We see footage of, packed hardcore gigs sometimes in America. Some friends have sent me gigs that were happening in Australia, although Victoria got shut down again over 10 cases. And we see that people are trying to do things, and maybe there's more things happening in Eastern Europe. Absolutely nothing, of course, happening in Ireland. But yet there are still gigs announced in September, October, November. And you have to wonder, everybody keeps saying to me, well, once the dust settles and we know, we'll be able to figure these things out. But I often think to myself, and especially over the last few weeks, does the dust settle? Is there a moment where you go, okay, we have some clarity now on what the rules are? I'm not sure that moment ever comes, actually. I think there might be no dust settling. I said many months ago that what I think will happen is that we'll be living in a sort of confused level 2, level 3. Don't forget, level 1 was the easiest lockdown, which we were never in Ireland, and 5 the harshest, which we spent the most time in of any city in the world, as I understand it. And we are literally still living in a level 2 or 3. I've seen political commentators say, hey, look, the sun's shining, there's people having pints outside, we're not in lockdown. Well, yes, we are in fucking lockdown. There's no comedy, no theatre, no music, there's travel restrictions, there's this, that, the other. These things are all still very much in place. So yes, we absolutely are. And when we aren't is when we are at zero, i.e. back to normal. But I have been beginning to think that there is no back to normal. The dust does not settle. We don't get clarity. We will only get a kind of, can this happen? Can this not happen? Okay, let's try. And then it's either get stopped or shut down. But how does that help bands who need to travel? This makes it almost impossible, because what you are saying is, yes, a public expression of art or creativity can exist, but it only can exist by the terms of the state and unelected health officials to decide whether it can. But you cannot plan anything on those terms. You cannot, Primordial cannot say, or any band cannot say, hey, we're coming to fly into Ireland next April for the show. And then one day before, get to the airport, or the morning of, get to the airport, and they go, well, you don't have the right paper of this, that, the other, because the rules were changed 2 days ago because of the turbo rat variant. I'm only saying that because I have actually got a bass pedal turbo rat sitting in front of me, and it was the first thing that came to my mind. But I might as well make those two words together and put variant after them, right? Well, we might as well. So let's call it, if the turbo rat variant happens and it's causing a bit of a concern, a bit of a ruckus in a suburb somewhere, in a leafy suburb, does that mean that X band flying in from Moldova or Narnia are just therefore cancelled due to the arbitrary nature of said laws? It's very possible. So therefore, how can you plan anything? So when you look at the Hellfest lineup, you can see it's almost daring it to be cancelled. How could you cancel Metallica, Fate No More, blah, 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 all these bands? Well, I think what we've been shown, as I said, is that the art and entertainment industry has had to learn is that, yes, you don't have the lobby, and yes, everything can be cancelled and altered and changed. And so, yet we're still working in the dark. I said to my people running agencies, venues, bars in Dublin, do you know if that gig you have booked on September the 10th can happen or whatever? They're like, no clue. Nobody's told us anything. So does the dust settle? Do people ever really know? Or we're just left in this weird grey area? And as you've known, if you've been listening to the podcast for the last 60 million episodes, you'll know that I constantly refer to the grey area. I'm not a man who goes for the sexy black and white answer, as I think nothing is an absolute. And I think most things do exist in the grey area, whether they are politicians' innate sociopathy or grifting cowardice, or the fact that some people think they're doing the right thing, or that some people have genuinely malign intent behind what they're doing. It's everything. It's all those things at once, and it's all those things jostling for position. So having a clear definition of what is and isn't allowed as the music industry moves ahead through its second summer of not being able to, exist. Are things going to change? When you look at the paper and you go, it says turbo rat variant, blah, 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 you go, they're prepping us for keeping this going into September, October, November, aren't they? I said to my alter ego, Boris, we have not heard from him for a while, but he still exists and around. And he says, yes, I agree, it's coming. And you think to yourself, yeah, they're prepping for another variation on this theme. And then you think to yourself, well, how does the music industry survive? And the answer is a variation of it that will agree to go, all right, we'll just go inside and there won't be any people there and we'll just stream it, and let's hope that your TikTok numbers are pretty good and the state will just keep propping up paying the rent for venues, and you might have the odd distance thing. But as we knew it, to see how that can exist, I find quite complicated. Third ad read is for Hate Couture, hateful yet tasteful apparel, clothing, venerating serial killers and tyrants and sure to piss off your nearest and dearest. www.hatecoutore616.com. Use the promo code ALAN and you will get free shipping. Go to it and check out the stuff they've got. And this brings me to my second quote, which is from Ian Brown. Now, I don't know if you know the Stone Roses. The Stone Roses released a huge album, Fool's Gold, I think. It's about 1990, the height of the Manchester scene. I remember it being like voted album of the century and stuff, and various magazines back in the day, and widely regarded as one of the greatest albums of all time by people who like that kind of thing. And Ian Brown has been very, very outspoken about what's happening, and this is a quote from a tweet from him. Every singer and musician who plays an event requiring vaccination with a GMO concoction, still in experimental trials made by companies with indemnity, is a wretch and a collaborator who deserves to be tarred and feathered. God damn it, Ian, don't hold back. And yeah, I mean, reading that, it made me first wonder, where are all the people who should be speaking out along the... If that quote is a 100-mile-an-hour quote, where are all the people who should be speaking out at 20, 30, 40, 50, 60 mile an hour? Where are all the moderate voices in the middle who might have had some effect, some things to say? Like, the Irish music industry has been on its knees. Okay, where has been the Bonos or whatever to say the Irish state needs to let people back on stages? There's no basis for this, that and the other. They were all quiet. Big musicians generally were super quiet, which doesn't surprise me because they've never really stood up for the small musicians' right to try and earn some kind of a living from the agency and travelling involved in playing music. But Ian has just gone straight for the jugular. And to just examine what he's saying, I mean, first of all, Ian is played in one of the, I suppose, biggest albums of all time, maybe, would it be? I mean, I don't know how many Fool's Gold has sold. I presume it should be 2 or 3 million copies. Maybe they weren't big in the USA and that never happened, but certainly when they reformed and came back to Dublin, there must have been 40,000 people there. So perhaps Ian has the financial ability to circumvent some of these rules when it might come to travelling and just hire that jet to go to that festival and play wherever. I don't know. Certainly if he's going to go on tour, and this is one of the things I've been talking about in the podcast, if testing, antigen and PCR testing stays as the financial cash cow that it is for airlines to make money back and Big Pharma to make more money, if that stays in place and bans are required, you need another one to enter Holland, to enter Belgium, to enter Denmark. You can't tour. It's as simple as that. All those tours that you see rebooked and rescheduled, if any of those things still stay in place, it's just impossible. It's absolutely impossible unless people just figure out ways of bending the rules, that there are venues that just don't require you to have those papers when you arrive. And so perhaps a sort of a kind of shadow touring, what's not the right thing to say, a sort of B-C division touring league will exist of venues who will just go, all right. But how can one plan to travel to get to those venues and know this? Is this something that just comes and forms over the next couple of years as people try and work around it, just like they did under authoritarian regimes? Look, there was punk rock in Hungary in the 1980s. People found a way to try and have gigs, but of course being stuck on this island doesn't help my band very much because we have to get on a plane. As many people from many other countries that are sort of slightly distant on the geographical periphery of the scene will have to do. I'm sure a Swedish punk rock band in Stockholm can find a way to play in a back room for 100 people, but the Scottish band supporting them won't be able to fly there to get there. But where are the voices between the banality of we all need to get this so we can all move forward? I mean, like, and the disgusting virtue signaling of people posting their cards on their Instagram and like, hey, that really has defied logic. If you're going to do it because you've weighed up the options and out of necessity think to yourself, okay, this is something I have to do to have a career anymore, okay. But as I said, the virtue signaling behind doing it, I really I find difficult to deal with. Just keep it to yourself. You don't need to post every medical decision you make to yourself or online. But I understand that's kind of not how people live anymore, and it comes back to our concept of making content. But where are the voices between Ian Brown at 100 miles an hour and just nothing? There has to be some voices of just concerned people who are going, I'm not necessarily talking about vaccination, but about how it leaves the music industry, where have people really come out and been able to say, look, if these rules don't change, for example, with Primordial, the state is still requiring people to quarantine on return from travelling, which basically just keeps us in Ireland. It basically says to any artist, hey, that art exhibition you want to go to in Budapest, you ain't going there. In fact, you ain't going anywhere. And which is quite amazing to me, as the Irish state has lent into art and culture for so many years, for all our playwrights, all our poets, all of this, that, the other. What they're saying is, hey, your play can go on Broadway, but you can't go to see the opening night. In fact, none of the people acting in it can really be Irish, because you're not going to be able to go there and return. Until that rule changes, we are basically stuck here. But I haven't heard anybody really say anything about that. I suppose, as I said again, it's because the whole scene is just holding its breath to see what is going to happen. But Ian Brown, with the GMO concoction still in experimental trials, I mean, I've had this conversation with people before, which is that the only way to have had long-term trials is to have had long-term trials. So unless you have a time machine and have moved ahead a couple of years to find out what's happening, you don't know. And that's pretty self-explanatory, because it addresses the linear nature of time as we understand it, without being such a smart-ass. Personally, if you look at malaria, polio, all these things, I shouldn't really probably get into this murky area, but I have nothing against any of those things. It's the structure that is surrounding all of this. The idea that this is the carrot to the stick, the key to your freedom, the structure around it, which is, that's what gets to me more. However, companies with indemnity, and yes, you will probably know that your states have granted these companies indemnity. If you don't know what indemnity is, look it up. But it basically is giving people a sort of free rein on some level. A wretch and a collaborator who deserves to be tarred and feathered. I like this sort of medieval imagery. Very much behind the tarred and feather idea. I think this is, smashing running wild style pirate metal imagery. But in quoting Ian Brown here, I'm not having a go at him. I think it's quite, in a way, it's quite incredible to me that once upon a time in the 60s, 70s and 80s, musicians did buck the trend. They did stand up against authority. They did try and hold power to account. They did say things that were beyond the pale, that were anti-state, that were anti-multinational. That was the nature of being an artist at one stage, was to try and hold power to account. Now, you may disagree with the nature of what Ian Brown is saying, but no one could say that he's not actually doing exactly that, trying to stand up against something far greater, far bigger, in the terms of art, of creativity, of all those kind of things that once upon a time people understood. But yet most of the musicians I see online now are actually saying the opposite. They're saying to people, hey, could you please conform for the greater good? Hey, could you not ask questions? Because you stop being skeptical. And I myself, as I come back to the beginning of what I said in the podcast, have come under fire from people and got in trouble. People who protesting the protester, as opposed to really trying to understand what you were trying to say. They're annoyed at the idea that I'm skeptical, irritated that I have questions, and would rather frame me as this or that or the other, rather than listen to the body of the podcasts that I've made. But yet it's been quite amazing to me, the amount of people who, especially in the metal scene, who have sung about rebellion and being against authority, but have deferred to it almost instantly in every way throughout this whole situation. And now many of them have gone quiet when I say to them, hey, remember that thing you said to me last August about being over the top. Well, hey, we're another year in. How's it going for you? How's it going for those steadfast opinions you were holding, as you told me to wind my neck in and not be so conspiratorial 12, 13, 14, 15 months ago? It's all gone pretty quiet on the Western Front since then. But I am quite flabbergasted and shocked at the level of conformity that has existed in a scene that has always sang about the opposite. Now, maybe there's things I've missed. I don't know. I suppose the fear is that if you come out and say something as extreme as Ian has said there, relatively, that you'll be painted as, I suppose, far right, a Trumpist, or this, that, the other. When in actuality, really, if you really dig down and look into what he's saying there, it's nothing really to do with politics, if you ask me. It's just about big pharma and medicine, really, at the bottom of the day, or bottom of the day, at the end of the day, at the bottom of the argument. But it will be painted as such by people who don't really want to listen to whatever a middle-aged white guy has to say about this whole current situation. And by that I mean Ian Brown. I do think that, though, there is another side to it, which is that for somebody like Ian Brown maybe has to realise that much lower level musicians who don't really have the choice. Maybe I can think of a good friend of mine who is playing acoustic music in bars, and if every bar is going to require him to show his passport certificate, his vaccine passport certificate, to just go in, to just play in front of a pub full of people and get his tips, how what are you going to do? Retrain yourself in middle age to try and pivot to the climate economy or to some other economy? You can't, if that's your whole life, if that's what you've done. Somebody like Ian Brown has, I guess, that's not what he was trying to say in his statement, but there are so many low-level musicians, and I would count myself as part of that, maybe not quite low level, but certainly on a level that without touring and festivals, it's taken 75 to 80% of your income away. Or, for most people, the touring and the playing live is the top-up that makes living possible, as opposed to surviving. Before I really, digress into the whole welfare state business, or if that becomes universal basic income, is a whole other conversation linked to dissent from the system that provides you that financial aid. But he isn't wrong about the trials, and he isn't wrong about indemnity. You can look those things up. But it certainly looks to me like what he's talking about is kind of on the cards at some stage, is that unless this recedes into the background like a bad dream, you can see next February, April, March, all those kind of months coming into the summer, the idea of huge mass gatherings being held in a field are going to send local councils into apoplexy, especially local councils who have those unelected health officials who've been living, working, ordering people around with impunity for the previous, well, let's be honest, almost 2 years. They aren't going to want to just let go of the reins and go, okay, young people out, enjoy yourself, be free. The percentage in the risk category are vaccinated, so off you go out and live your lives again. I don't think that happens, because I don't think power relinquishes power. I don't think that's the nature of power. And once you've allowed people to act with impunity and, as Ian says, indemnity, why would they give it back? And this is the confused nature of the argument right now. When you say to people, I just say to people, why would that happen? And they just think, and you just say to them, well, do you think the world is fair and just in that respect? Well, just take a little bit of a look back through history. Well, I suppose not. Or the very simple asshole question, has a bad thing ever happened in history? Yes or yes. Could this be one? Yes or yes. There is no argument. History is not on your side, my friend. Of course, I'm not saying everything is some drastic Machiavellian plot. Of course not. The truth is always grey and rather dull and bureaucratic and chaotically mundane, somewhere in the middle. But I do wonder where the people who are, as I said, between a mile an hour and 100 mile an hour, if we take Ian's quote at 100 mile an hour, where's all the people in the middle ground? I found myself kind of standing alone in podcast terms, at least trying to discuss some of the things that are happening. I don't know, or have found very few people that are willing to discuss it. Most of the musicians I've come across the metal scene as I said, I mean, maybe privately will express to me their worries, but they don't really want to talk about it that much on online or on YouTube. Some do, some don't. But I think it's more the instant nature of personal social media, which is like, here's the picture of me with my card. The virtue signaling involved in that. What you're saying is, I am a virtuous person. I am doing the right thing. I don't want your granny to die. And we all know that the argument isn't that simple. It's not that simple at all. And some of what Mr. Brown has said crystallizes the argument against it. Now, admittedly, what he said makes it very easy for the mainstream media to pillory him, to not take him seriously, because it's using language that is pretty inflammatory. And of course, in this black and white world where people will only look at headlines or only look at they only want the most angry response, because that's what social media rewards. It rewards the most extreme voice, the most angry voice. And so moderate woman says moderate thing or reasonable thing is never going to get the headlines. So maybe that's why we don't hear from people in the middle going, hang on, I have a few concerns about this, which is where I've been trying to position myself in the realms of the skeptical, in the realms of asking questions. The realms of asking questions. What terrible grammar. But I do wonder where all the people in the middle are. And I do wonder about the motives of those who continually need to, as I said, to virtue signal to people they don't know about something they don't necessarily maybe understand. And that's part of the problem, my friends. What a ramble. What an all over the place kind of discussion. But what I was trying to do was, I've been holding off making a video about the music industry for a little while. Just kind of wanted to see if that metaphorical dust would settle a bit more as you saw things like Psycho Las Vegas being announced and other festivals and other things going ahead. And it still made me wonder, how are those bands from Europe getting across to that festival? Are those things going to become clear or not clear? Are we, of course, hedging our bets that we are going to move back towards reopening on such terms? Or is something else going to come along and scupper them? There's all so many ifs and whats and whereabouts and complex questions that I'm not sure do get answered for us. So what I wanted to do was just take those two quotes, consider them in terms of the modern music industry, and also in terms of what I'm doing here talking to you, which is essentially creating content. And is that the very nature of the argument? Well, my friends, episode 63 is one of those ones that just comes out in one go, so to speak. That will be it, my friends. Planet Satan over and out. I'm Alan Averill. This is Agitators Anonymous. Hope that gave you some food for thought. Didn't get me into too much trouble again. Skepticism is the only rational perspective on everything.